My name's Peter Barrett. I'm just presenting with Jono Frew from Natural Performance, so I'll get Jono to introduce himself.
Cool, thanks Peter. Hi everyone, my name's Jono Frew. I am a regenerative agriculture coach and consultant. I go around the country with my time and educate and empower farmers to be able to increase their profitability, resilience, joy and peace of mind through aligning with nature with a focus on soil health. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I think Peter and I will just go through this presentation together. And Pete, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sounds good. I'm the family representative of Linnburn Station. My background, as you can see, what's on the screen right now. I've worked in a number of different industries other than farming. I've worked in tourism, technology, finance, and I came back here to Linnburn Station in 2012. I was doing the financials from 2007 overseas. Linnburn Station is located where you can see here on the map on the right hand side, and on the left there you can see that's the farm. We're 9,000 hectares. We're in the Otago, and we're really quite a dry property. We go for 400 metres, 1,300 metres, about is regenerative agriculture and my journey on it. You can see the environment. We go negative 20 degrees to 40 degrees in summer, so we're a very brittle, challenged environment. My background has obviously been in a number of different industries, and I'm quite analytical. I came back here 2012. Started learning about conventional agriculture, and I was good enough to have managers on the farm at the time that conventional agriculture. One of the learnings I had on that journey was when we did what's called visual soil assessments, we had no worms in some of our pastures. Now, to give you a bit of background, my grandfather farmed the property until 1986. He had 3 daughters. And so after he passed, then we had managers. We had managers from 86 until essentially 2012 when I came back on the farm. So that's about 26 years. And they've been farming the animals, but we had not really been maintaining the asset. So when I did this analysis, it was with a view to trying to understand where we are currently and how we could improve. I use the analogy, it's kind of like having a flat in Dunedin that had not been maintained, and all of a sudden you have to have a do-up project. And so we started doing, and I learned pretty quickly along that journey that if we kept on doing things conventionally with the amount of land we had, we were going to go broke pretty quickly. And one of the experiences I had on that was we would cultivate, we would go and put fertilizer and everything out in paddocks. And one year we did that with the seed. And then I'm sitting there, after nothing had grown, because in our environment, we don't get a lot of rain. We can get 170 mils some years. I was sitting there with the fertilizer consultant saying, well, what do we do this year? And they said to me, well, you just put the same fertilizer recommendation on that you did the next year. So I thought at that stage, that was a little bit crazy. I felt like I was being sold something. And so I started looking at other options. So I'd learned that I didn't have worms from doing things conventionally. And I learned that I potentially was being sold stuff. I looked overseas, and what I found was diversity of plants. Spoke to a guy called Gabe Brown, and then I started to learn how different plants can be utilized to be able to cultivate and build fertility in the ground. So this is an example of what we use in our paddocks. And so I'll just hand back over to Jono quickly here, but the key learning on that journey was I moved away from ryegrass and clover and maybe 1 or 2 other things to 20 to 30 species in our pastures. I'd use multi-species, and you can see there legumes, chenopod's, grasses, brassicas, and I'd embraced how to use microbiology, and I changed the mindset. How can I work with nature instead of trying to control things?
Beautifully said, Peter. And the thing for Peter's, what was on his side going through that journey is, he really didn't have any of the prehistoric notions around the way things should look with coming in, from other industries. Me, on the other hand, I was actually a chemical and fertilizer agronomist for many years, as well as being responsible for managing high production, high input, high output dairy farms and arable, as well as sheep and beef farms for 15 years. So I had all of this understanding and expertise around growing crops as monocultures. And that was really easy and simple to work out. Although it was simple and easy to work out, for instance, what plants needed for their nutrients to be able to grow and achieve the tonnage or yield that we wanted to achieve, all that information is there. All the literature around what plants require to grow as far as nutrients in the soil, all that information has been, discovered through research on focusing on monocultures and how they behave in sterile environments. When I met Peter in 2017, I had just stepped out of a role of managing a 200 hectare mixed cropping sheep and beef farm that was certified organic, where I learnt firstly about soil health and it being a living organism, essentially a complex living system, but also discovered this thing about growing plants and diversity. So once I was told for the first time to plant a bunch of seeds in with my pure stand of barley, the monoculture of barley, in one of my management roles at Harts Creek Farm, I did so with a lot of hesitancy, because I was like, now, hang on a minute, all these plants are going to compete with this gorgeous crop of barley that I had growing, because I was, trained and educated in growing barley and keeping it clean, as in no other plants competing. I had this mindset of competition. And so I did this as a trial, put these 12 different species in underneath this barley, because I was told to by the farm owner, with a little underlying intention to prove him wrong. So I left a strip unplanted so that I could prove to him that actually this notion was crazy. Planting all these other plants with my barley is just going to strangle it, compete, take nutrients, etc. Come harvest, the area that was planted, most of the paddock that was planted with 12 hectares, I only left a little strip untreated right at the end. The area that was planted with these 12 other species grew over 1.5 tons more barley and was clean, as in had no rust. Whereas the area that I left as a monoculture that I was certain was going to grow better because it had no competition was full of rust and ended up yielding 1.5 tons less barley. So that started my inquiry. And then when I met Pete was sort of a couple of years into his journey of utilizing diversity. And we started to play with diversity, getting up over 30 species, right up to 70 different species. And what we found was the more diversity we offered to our environments, as in the amount of different plants we planted into our soil, the more profound the outcomes. And we started to see results that really challenged my historic education around the way that we should grow things and the way that things should look. So the mind's... Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, well, I guess the reason for that is if you look at, every plant has a different root structure. And what we typically have used in a lot of our farming environments is grasses and clovers. They have very fine root structures that don't get very deep. Whereas at the other end, we have trees which are large and intrusive. And so what we use when we use a lot of these cover crops and different things is we use different root architectures to be able to get air and water into the soil profile that then open up the soil, or they actually even photosynthesize different complex carbon chains that feed biology. And so that's when diversity is actually able to move you from a compacted environment to a free environment a lot more quickly than, let's say, grass and clover.
Because if we look at the complexity of the organisms within the soil, of which if we were to dig up a teaspoon of healthy soil, there's actually more microorganisms living in that teaspoon of healthy soil than there have ever been human beings living on this planet. And each of those microbes are working in symbiotic relationship with other plants and organisms in the soil, as well as being food sources and predators, etc., creating this complexity that produces outcomes that we wouldn't see when we didn't have that diversity. See, like us human beings, the microbes in the soil are each good at different things. They have different strengths, different weaknesses. And the more diversity of organisms we have in our soil, the more outcomes we get, like, increases in all of the micronutrients, provisions of complex proteins and carbohydrates and trace elements, secondary metabolites, etc., delivered straight to the plant just through this activity. But it starts with the habitat. We've got to have the habitat. And that was the missing in my historic background around agronomy, was just the understanding of the soil being the house for the biology. That was something that was missing in my education. And that if we don't have air and water being able to infiltrate through our soil profile, we can't expect those organisms to do the work for us. So we get stuck on having to continue applying these nutrients, a lot of which actually speed up and increase the degradation in our soil, which leaves us reliant even more on it. We get stuck on that rat wheel.
Just to clarify that, some of the inputs we use are like taking antibiotics. They sterilize the environment. And so when we don't encourage life, then all of a sudden we're like a drug addict. We've got to come along and we've got to feed the machine with all the different minerals required. If you look at the screen I'm showing you right now, the top left is what we used to be like summer or winter. There was a lot of expansive ground that's very rocky and it was not highly productive. So the way in which we changed that is we put cover crops, where in the bottom left here, you get stuff to grow that is high. It protects the ground. It opens the ground up. So if I get a little bit of moisture, all of a sudden it's going to infiltrate. In the environment where it's just like the carpet you're probably sitting around, then I get heat and any moisture that's in that environment leaves straight away. So I'm able to go from a very challenged environment, plant cover crops which grow very quickly, open up the soil profile, and then without any other inputs, no fertilizer, and then from there I'm able to go to perennials. So I'm able to change the environment, and my learning from doing that is the $1 spend of $1 spent compared with conventional, I can get 3 times the area cultivated. So for my same $1 spend when I was doing it conventionally, I was able to regenerate 3 times the area. This here is mycorrhizal fungi, and you can see here how diverse and spreading it is. It's like the reinforcing steel in the concrete. It holds soils together. So when I come back to environments like I showed you before, this environment in the top left here is very fungal. It's very sleepy. So brown environments are typically more fungal, and so they're going to have a lot more fungi in that environment. And so I'm not going to get as much erosion, for example. And this is how plants share nutrients using the fungi. And so what I learned is that if the reason I didn't have worms in my environment is because I did not have diversity of plants. I did not have different green things in the environment that are taking energy from the sun with green solar panels and pumping liquid carbon into the ground to create an environment for the other life to flourish. So if the worms don't have anything to eat, then they're not going to be there. So as soon as I created the environment for these to get functioning, all of a sudden worms turn up.
Yeah. And so it's a different approach. We're used to seeing issues and then treating symptoms of those issues with inputs and different management strategies. What we are discovering is that through shifting our mindset and our perspective of the way things function, we don't need to be sending the ambulance to the bottom of the cliff anymore. We're always thinking one step ahead. What is our most limiting factor right now? What's causing the hold up in the velocity of the flywheel, the natural flywheel that will support us in our farming systems to produce healthy soil, healthy plants, and healthy animals, which equals healthy people. We've got 2 minutes, Peter. What do we want to finish with?
I think you can see on the screen there that there's some principles that we operate by, but the real key on what we do, you'll see we haven't got time to go through all these slides, but the real key about this whole thing is typically we work in an environment where we use, in a conventional environment, we use grasses, clovers, maybe chicory and plantain. We're moving that to be even more diverse, where we try to include 20 to 30 different species. We're moving the mindset to say, well, we're going to encourage life. If we get weeds, Weeds are actually an indicator for what you're deficient in. And so what we are about is actually encourage them to do a job. For example, when I plant those mixes, if I see thistle or dock, they've got a taproot that's trying to get air in there. So we're using plants like sorghum or sunflower or radish to replicate what the weed's trying to do to change that environment. It's also moving the focus to carbon. So we're moving to carbon, but carbon is the currency of the underground environment. It's taking CO2 from the atmosphere, creating liquid carbon complex chains that microbes share. It's about grazing management and really high intensity and making sure you leave the ground covered and encouraging life. That's us.
Or is it us? Maybe it's not.
We've got more time. We can go back through those things.
We can talk forever if you let us.
This is the diversity. I'll just show it up there. So you can do integrating animals. Then we're using living roots and keeping them operating as long as we can. If we've got roots in the ground for longer, then they're feeding microbes. When we leave things fallow, then all of a sudden microbes haven't got anything to live on. So we're always here, we're planting green, we're terminating with a crimping roller. Here, this is an example here of a monoculture versus diversity planted on the same day. You can see the monoculture struggled and the diversity is done really well. The learning I have, when I put diversity in, all of a sudden, I start to get worms. We've gone through, we've analysed what all different seeds come up with, what their benefits are, how they deal with surface compaction, phosphorus and potassium, beneficial organisms, and then what you end up with is life.
And all the information is available on the Symbiosis website.
Thank you for your quick run through a complicated and challenging story, and it's great to hear what you've accomplished. I open the floor for questions. If anyone has a question, they can either speak up via their mic, or we can go to questions on the chat, and we've got one already. And so Femi has asked, wondering how far this practice has gone in terms of production / profitability, in terms of a production profitability frontier, and he's raising the question in relation to the potential to service farm debt. Do you have any observations in that space?
Pete's the finance man. I'll let him.
You know, what I found, like I spoke to you before, is I was spending X amount of dollars doing 250 hectares of new pasture each year. Now I can get up to 750 for 1,000 for the same dollar spend. So what that's allowing me to do is it's allowing me to get further than I would have been able to do if I'd stuck to the conventional approach in my environment, because I worked out my biggest limitation was moisture. So instead of really focusing on putting heaps of money, I could go and cultivate and then put all this fertilizer out there, and then all of a sudden moisture doesn't turn up, and it hasn't really worked for me. When I put diversity of plants in there, what you find is if the rain doesn't come today, the plants will sit there and they will germinate at a particular time. It's about changing your expectations on timeframes and what have you. From a profitability perspective, well, we started this in 2013. We're still operating here in 2021. You know, we've got 60 kilometres of fencing on the boundary. We've got 7 houses. We've been able to refurbish the houses. We've done 3,000 hectares of land, and every dollar that we make, we put back into the land. So we couldn't have done that if we had been doing it conventionally.